Welcome, and thank you for joining us here at History to Snooze By. Tonight, we invite you to rest your thoughts and settle into a slower rhythm, a quiet journey through time told gently, one breath at a time. This is not a story of battles or strategy. It is a story of silence, of mud and frost, of boots worn thin by waiting. In this calm, reflective sleep series, we follow the lives of ordinary soldiers during the First World War. Not the generals, not the headlines, but the men who lived in the trenches, shoulder to shoulder, through cold mornings, sleepless nights, and long stretches of uncertainty. Each chapter will take you deeper into their daily world. You'll walk duckboards in the dark, warm your hands beside the barrel fire, wait for the whistle, and carry letters in your coat pocket that may never be sent. Through it all, the pace will remain slow and steady. There will be no sudden sounds, no tension, only the soft rhythm of footsteps, the quiet flicker of lanterns, and the simple human rituals that carried them forward. If you find your eyes growing heavy, that's all right. You don't need to stay awake for every word. Let the voices of the past keep you company. And when you're ready, we'll begin with part 1, the first night in the trench. But for now, breathe in, let it go, and drift gently back in time to the quiet spaces between the noise. Part 1, the arrival. The train crawled through the low hills of northern France, its windows misted with condensation from the breath of young men packed inside. Damp uniforms brushed against one another in the cramped wooden carriages, heavy with the scent of wool, tobacco, and unspoken fear. Outside, the landscape rolled by in dull shades of brown and gray, the winter fields lying bare beneath a wide and leaden sky. A church steeple passed, then a crumbled wall, then nothing but low trees and wind-blown earth. The train's whistle sounded, not sharp, but weary, before it hissed to a final stop in the middle of nowhere. There was no station, only a bare platform, a stretch of wooden boards laid beside the tracks, and a thin layer of snow melting into mud under the boots of officers waiting in long coats. One by one, the men climbed down. They carried rifles over their shoulders and canvas packs on their backs. Their helmets, still clean and round, looked strange above faces too young to have known war. The older ones walked more slowly, boots sinking into the thick slush along the path. No one spoke above a whisper. Only the wind moved freely, catching loose buttons and the corners of maps held in trembling hands. The march began without ceremony. The village they passed through had long since emptied. Stone cottages stood with their roofs broken and windows gaping open like mouths. A shop front leaned to one side, the remnants of a painted sign barely legible above its shattered door. The sound of boots echoed off the stone walls, but no dogs barked. No children played. The silence was complete. Mud claimed everything here. It clung to boots, to wheels, to the legs of the horses pulling carts of supplies down the narrow road. The rations were packed in wooden crates marked with numbers and codes, each one damp with recent rain. An officer barked a soft instruction to keep moving. The men obeyed, not yet tired, but already aware of the weight of their journey. As they walked, the wind carried a faint thunder from the east. It rolled low and distant, like the shifting of a great sea just beyond the hills. A few men turned their heads toward the sound, but said nothing. It was not a sound they had heard before in the world they knew. Not thunder, not a storm. It was the voice of artillery far ahead, murmuring its presence like a drumbeat beneath the earth. By the time they reached the edge of the woods, the light had begun to fade. The sun, hidden behind a sky of flat clouds, dipped lower, throwing a pale wash of color across the fields. In the dying light, the trench line came into view. It was not a line at all, but a jagged wound cut into the land, barely visible until they stood at its rim. Wooden slats formed crude steps down into the narrow channel. Sandbags were stacked in uneven walls, stained dark with water and time. Barbed wire lay coiled in silent knots along the top edge, rusted and sharp. A soldier in a patched coat stood at the entrance, a cigarette glowing in the shadow of his helmet. He didn't speak. He only nodded once, and the newcomers began their descent. Inside the trench, the air changed. It was close and damp, with a scent that could not be named at once. It held earth and rot, smoke and sweat, and something beneath it all that spoke of long decay. The mud here was not like the mud of the countryside. It was deeper, blacker, and filled the boots with a sucking grip. Some of the men stumbled. Others caught them by the arm. No one laughed. The trench turned left, then right. It dropped lower in places, then climbed again, like a tunnel dug by desperate hands. Duckboards ran the length of it, but many were broken or missing. Water pooled in the hollows. Frogs could be heard in some places, croaking softly in defiance of the war above them. Further along, alcoves appeared in the walls, dugouts built into the earthen sides. Inside, dim candles flickered in bottles. A stove hissed in one corner, barely giving heat. Tin cups sat beside folded coats and half-written letters. The walls were lined with wooden planks, hammered in at odd angles. A corporal sat at a table made from a crate, quietly writing something with a stub of pencil. No one welcomed the new arrivals. They were expected. They were not the first. They would not be the last. Up above, the sky darkened into slate. A single flare lit the air far to the east, a white spark drifting down in slow arcs. Then came the dull boom of a distant shell, followed by silence again. No one ducked. Not this time. It was far enough away. The officer led them to a section of trench barely 5 feet across. There were no dugouts here, only the open line, exposed and raw. A few of the older soldiers crouched in firing positions, rifles resting on sandbags, eyes fixed on the far horizon. One of them chewed on something. Another kept whispering to himself. The newcomers were told to rest, to keep low, and to wait for instructions. And so they sat. Some leaned against the wall, their shoulders pressed into the rough mud, legs stretched out, and boots already soaked. Others crouched, arms around their knees, trying not to meet each other's eyes. The cold crept into their fingers. Their breath came out in small clouds. The light had vanished entirely now, and the trench had become a place of shadow, shaped by the flicker of lanterns and the brief glow of cigarettes. Somewhere up the line, a voice called out. Then another answered. A name was spoken, then silence returned. In the hours that followed, nothing happened. A man down the line lit a stove and passed around a tin of weak tea. It tasted of iron and rain. The bread they were given was hard and dry, the cheese pale and crumbling. One of them had brought a chocolate bar from home, and he broke it into pieces no larger than coins. They ate without speaking. At last, a sergeant appeared and gave them their orders. They would take turns on sentry duty, 2 hours at a time. Keep eyes forward. Keep low. Don't speak unless necessary. Watch the wire. Watch the sky. The rules were spoken plainly, as if carved into the mud itself. The men nodded. The sergeant left. Then the night truly settled. The trench became quieter still. The only sounds were the occasional splash of boots in water, the click of a rifle bolt being checked, the soft scrape of a match against a coat. Far above, the stars tried to show themselves through the cloud cover. A rat ran along the top of the wall, then disappeared. Another followed it. A young soldier, not yet 20, leaned his head back against the earth. His eyes closed, not in sleep, but in something close to it. His face was pale, his hands trembling slightly beneath his greatcoat. He did not cry. He did not speak. He listened. To the quiet, to the distant guns, to the breath of others nearby. They had arrived, not in a place, not in a moment, but in a different kind of world, one made of earth and waiting, of silence broken by thunder, of days marked only by the changing light and the sound of names being spoken and then forgotten. This was the beginning. Part 2. Into the Earth. The days that followed were quiet in the way a slow tide is quiet, never still, never silent, but always moving just beneath the surface. Morning arrived not with sunlight, but with a subtle shift in the quality of the gloom. The black of night softened to a muted gray. No rooster called. No bells rang. The trench did not wake, it simply changed its color. The men stirred from where they had slept, if sleep had come at all. Most had dozed in short, shivering intervals, seated on their packs or curled in corners. The earth around them held the chill of winter in its core. The trench walls were slick with moisture, the surface beaded with cold sweat. Condensation clung to their rifles and the buckles of their kit. At first, there was little motion, just the sound of breathing. Then boots scuffed duckboards, and men rose stiffly from where they had lain. The early routine was unspoken, learned quickly and without ceremony. Each man found his task in the shape of another's motion. One filled a kettle over the cook stove. Another checked the ammunition stored in a sandbag-lined niche. A third fetched a shovel and disappeared around the bend. The trench itself stretched like a narrow maze beneath the sky, a long, winding scar in the skin of the earth. From above, it might have looked like nothing more than a line of broken shadow. But within its walls, life followed an order both rigid and strange. There were firing bays and dugouts, communication trenches and supply lines, each marked by the way the mud pooled or the wood creaked beneath a step. The deeper parts of the trench system lay ahead. The officer led a small group of new arrivals through its turns, pointing now and then to names scratched into wooden signs. Sap A, Bay 2, Fire Step North. The design was meant to confuse shellfire, to spare lives from the straight-line cruelty of enemy aim. But to those inside, it was a labyrinth of damp walls and whispered instructions. At one corner, a man climbed from a dugout, his shoulders hunched and his face wrapped in a scarf. He offered a nod and carried on, the folds of his coat heavy with damp. In another bend, a soldier stood with his back to the trench wall, trimming a candle with a clasp knife. His rifle rested against a crate beside him. He did not look up. Overhead, the light remained dim. Clouds thickened, and a cold drizzle began to fall. The rain was not hard, but it was relentless, slipping past helmets and down into collars, seeping into sleeves and boots. No one raised a complaint. The silence of the trench was shaped by endurance. Words were saved for necessity, and even those were spoken softly. The guide stopped at a dugout entrance. "This is yours," he said. His voice was low, but clear. One by one, the men ducked inside. The ceiling was low, supported by timber and sandbags. The air smelled of oil, mildew, and old food. A stove in the corner had not yet been lit. Straw covered the floor in patches, already darkened by footsteps and time. A single lantern hung from a nail, casting a small circle of amber light that danced with the movement of shadows. They set down their packs. A journal lay open on a crate. its pages curled from damp. It had been left behind, or perhaps passed on. No name, just a list of rations and a note about lice powder. Beside it, a tin of bully beef sat unopened. One man picked it up, considered it, and set it back down. For a time, no one moved. The day passed without measure. In the trench, time was not divided by hours, but by sounds. The clatter of a mess tin, the rustle of mail, the distant report of artillery. Even those came irregularly. A distant shell would break the stillness, followed by silence long enough to doubt it had happened at all. Then another would come, nearer or farther, its echo rumbling along the trench walls like a whisper traveling underground. At the center of the trench, men worked steadily. A wiring party prepared coils of barbed wire to be carried out after dusk. Others packed sandbags for reinforcement, their hands moving with the rhythm of repetition. Shovels scraped against clay. Wooden boards were pulled from the mud, checked for rot, then hammered back into place. No one rushed. Everything was done with the patience of those who understood that hurrying changed nothing. Lunch, if it could be called that, arrived in tins. The stew was thin, more broth than meal, but warm. The men leaned into their bowls, steam curling up into the damp air. Bread was handed out, stiff from the cold. Tea followed, boiled black and metallic. No one lingered long after eating. Cups were emptied, cleaned with cloths, and tucked away again. A few hours later, orders came down. They were to prepare for a listening post after nightfall, 2 men forward, just beyond the wire. The trench fell quieter. Each man understood what that meant. Crawling into no man's land was not heroic. It was methodical, silent, and filled with the kind of danger that left no room for bravery. The trench was prepared. Rifles were checked. Bandoliers adjusted. Extra boots were wrapped in rags to silence their steps. When night came, it fell fast. The last light died in the folds of the sky, leaving only the wind and the dull glint of stars. The men moved carefully, slowly, blending with the darkness. In the distance, the German line was invisible, hidden by night and shadow. But every man knew it was there. Somewhere beyond the wire, behind their own fear and mud, there was another trench filled with men who moved and waited just as they did. The 2 chosen men crawled forward, flat against the earth. Their shapes disappeared into the black. The others waited, rifles ready, eyes wide in the dark. A flare went up far to the north, casting a white glow that froze the trench in ghostly light for a moment. Then it was gone. Minutes passed, then more. Finally, a signal, a faint knock against the shovel blade. The men returned. No contact, no movement. But they had listened, and that was enough. Sometimes survival was the only measure of success. The trench breathed again. Later that night, as the stars thinned and the first suggestion of dawn touched the eastern rim, the trench grew still once more. A few men wrote letters, hunched beneath dim lanterns. The paper was coarse, pencils dull, but the words came slowly, shaped by memory and longing. Others sat in silence, backs pressed to the wall, boots still caked in mud. The dugout held the warmth of breath and bodies. A small fire crackled in the stove, barely enough to warm fingers, but enough to remind them of light. One man mended his sock with a needle and thread. Another watched the smoke rise to the low ceiling and vanish in a slow twist. No one spoke of the future. Sleep came in pieces. A few hours at a time, interrupted by duty, by cold, by the far-off thump of guns. In the trench, even rest carried the weight of uncertainty. But for now, beneath the earth, they were sheltered. However imperfect, however brief, the walls around them held fast against the night. Outside, the wind shifted. The clouds moved slowly west. Rain might come again, or snow, or fire. But for this moment, there was only the sound of breathing, of boots settling deeper into straw, of the stove's fading hiss. A few men dreamed, though they would not remember of what, and the trench endured. It had no clock. It had no face. It did not mourn or wait. It simply held them all, like the earth holds water after the rain, quietly and without judgment. They were now part of it, as all soldiers became in time, buried not by death, but by the living silence of war. Part 3. Mud and Silence. The days blurred into one another, as if time itself had fallen into the mud with the men who lived among it. There were no clocks in the trenches, and if there had been, they would have only marked the slow, gray drift of hours that passed without notice. Morning light came not with color, but with a dim lifting of the darkness, a thinning of the black sky that revealed the trench walls coated in frost. Mud had become everything. It lined the trench floors, spilled into the dugouts, and clung to every surface like a second skin. It was not the familiar mud of fields and rivers. This was heavier, more alive. It moved underfoot, rising to the ankles, sometimes the knees, sucking at boots until soles tore loose. There were places where it could swallow a man to the waist if he stepped wrong. Shovels stood nearby for such emergencies, though even rescue was slow and laborious. It was in the seams of jackets, the laces of boots, the folds of blankets, and the cracks of hands. It slicked the barrel of the rifle and softened the pages of pocket notebooks. At times it seemed to speak in silence, asking nothing and offering only weight. A soldier once joked that it had a mind of its own, that it was watching, but no one laughed. Over time, they learned to move carefully. Each step was tested before weight was placed. Duckboards helped, but many were broken or had vanished under the water. The men balanced along their narrow ridges, arms outstretched, rifles held high to keep them dry. When they slipped, and they always slipped, they did so without complaint. Mud did not cause panic. It caused resignation. Beyond its grasp, there was the stillness. For days at a time, the line was quiet. No bombardment, no raids, no gunfire. Only the ever-present silence broken by distant sounds, the creak of wood, the drip of rain, the flutter of pigeon wings overhead. Sometimes they heard a cough from the German trench, or a song, low and rough, half a mile away. The lines were close enough to sense each other, but not always to fight. The quiet was a different kind of enemy. It did not come with warning. It did not end. It crept into the thoughts of men and settled behind their eyes. It made every sound seem louder. The flick of a lighter, the crack of a biscuit, the snap of a twig. They jumped at these things not because they feared them, but because they were so rare. Without noise, the imagination filled the void. Some men grew superstitious. They swore they could feel when something was about to happen. Others grew still, their eyes fixed on the horizon with a kind of detached calm, like statues carved into the trench wall. There were dreams, too, long ones, short ones, fragments. Some were remembered. Others were left behind like a whisper in the fog. In the dugouts, time passed in slow rituals. Cleaning rifles, folding letters, scraping boots, boiling tea in battered tins. These acts became sacred not because they mattered, but because they kept the mind tethered to something. Each motion was a thread holding them above the weight of silence. Letters arrived when they could. They came wrinkled and spotted, sealed with shaking hands. A few were from wives. others from sisters or neighbors. Some were filled with news of harvests and rain, of birthdays missed and parcels sent. A few brought news of deaths. These letters were not read aloud. One soldier, known simply as Harris, received a letter each week from his mother. She described the weather in Kent, the state of the garden, the well-being of the cat. Harris read them by the light of a candle, lips moving silently, then folded them back into their envelopes and placed them beneath his shirt near his chest. They were creased with mud and warmth. Another wrote daily, though he rarely sent them. His pages filled quickly, thoughts, memories, lists of birds he remembered from home. He didn't sign them. He folded them into small squares and tucked them beneath his bedroll, where they slept in silence beside him. Meals were the same as ever. Bully beef, bread hard as brick, tea brewed from powder. Sometimes there were onions, sometimes jam. Always the same color, always the same taste. A dull mix of iron, salt, and the damp that seeped into everything. Conversation was brief, often practical. Pass the tin. Your turn on watch. Keep your socks dry. But sometimes in the longer hours when the rain tapped softly on the roof and the wind blew without threat, they spoke of other things. A school teacher talked of a river he used to fish. A boy of 17 described his father's bakery, the way it smelled at 4 in the morning, the warmth of the ovens. An older man remembered a horse he once owned, its name, its color, the sound of its breath in winter. These were not stories. They were acts of remembering, of protecting small pieces of life that still felt real. Mud claimed the feet. Silence claimed the mind. But memory held the line. Outside, the trench changed shape with every rain. Walls collapsed. Ceilings sagged. The water table rose. Engineers worked tirelessly to hold it together, but the earth always fought back. Shovels rang against wood and stone. Sandbags were shifted, boards replaced, ditches drained. Nothing lasted more than a few days. Rats flourished. They were not afraid. They scurried boldly between boots, climbed rations, nested in forgotten blankets. Some were small and quick. Others were large, bloated on scraps. They chewed through everything, letters, socks, even corpses when they could. No man enjoyed their company, but few had the energy to fight them. Some shot at them for sport. Others ignored them, eyes dull, hands busy with more pressing tasks. One soldier gave a name to the largest of them, called him Marshall, and left crumbs beside the stove each night. It became a kind of joke, but no one laughed loudly. Jokes like letters had become things to hold gently, like match flames in the wind. The weather worsened. Wind blew down from the north, sharp and bitter, threading its way through every gap in the trench. It howled along the open lines and whistled between the dugouts. Men pulled scarves over their mouths and pressed deeper into their coats. Fires burned low, if at all. The smoke clung to the walls and drifted upward in thin blue spirals. Rain became sleet. Fingers stiffened. Boots froze solid overnight. Water turned to ice in the basins and clung to the canvas covers like silver skin. Breath steamed in clouds. When a man removed his gloves, he did so carefully, slowly, as if each finger held glass beneath the skin. Frostbite was common. It began in the toes, the fingertips, the tips of the ears. A tingling at first, then numbness, then pain. Some men ignored it too long. A few lost digits. Others were evacuated. Most simply endured. And still the trench was quiet. This silence did not mean peace. It meant waiting. It meant that something was being planned or that nothing was. It meant that life continued in slow steps, marked only by the sound of mud sucking at boots and the low cough of men trying to clear their lungs. There was no music, no birdsong, only the slow churn of thoughts and the endless reach of the mud. And then, without warning, a sound. One shell, far away, then two more, closer, then silence again. The men looked to the sky. Clouds moved as they always had, slow and gray. But something had changed. They felt it in their bones. Not fear exactly, but readiness, like a breath drawn, but not yet released. They checked their rifles. They adjusted their straps. They waited, and the trench held its breath with them. Part 4. Rats and Rain. The rain did not fall in torrents. It rarely did. Instead, it arrived as a quiet, unending curtain of moisture that seemed to seep from the very air. It came softly, without storm or warning, and stayed for days. The sky became a blanket of dull gray, stretching without end from horizon to horizon, pressing gently downward until the land sagged beneath its weight. Inside the trench, there was no escaping it. Rain found its way through every seam and every stitch. It slid down the walls of the dugouts and pooled beneath the duckboards, filling hollows and cracks until boots were submerged and knees were wet. It clung to the canvas covers like skin and whispered against helmets with the rhythm of a dying clock. The water rose slowly, not in surges, but with the patient insistence of time. Clothing never dried. Blankets hung limp. Coats became heavy with moisture, smelling of wool, mud, and sweat. Gloves were damp before they were pulled on. Socks were soaked before the boots even touched the boards. Each footfall left a wet impression that was erased the moment it was made, as if the trench itself refused to remember who had passed through it. The men adjusted as best they could. Oilcloth was stretched across dugout entrances, but it sagged under the weight of collected water. Tin cans were placed to catch drips. Stoves were moved to higher ground, though their fires sputtered more than they burned. In the narrow corridors, men walked with shoulders hunched and collars pulled high, heads down and eyes half closed against the wind that blew thin threads of rain through the trench's winding paths. The mud thickened into a dark paste. It clung to the legs and tugged at soles with each step. The duckboards became slick and treacherous. More than one man slipped and disappeared into the deeper pools, rising with curses swallowed quickly into the cold air. And through it all came the rats. They were bold in ways no creature should be. They darted along the trench walls, between crates and boots, under the duckboards, and into the dugouts. They came by the dozen, then by the hundred, their small claws tapping against wood and stone, their eyes glinting in the flicker of lantern light. No effort to remove them lasted long. Some men kept clubs nearby and swung without warning. Others set traps fashioned from tin and wire, baited with crumbs and ration scraps. But the rats returned always. They gnawed through sacks of grain. They bit into boots and fingers alike. They stole soap, candles, paper. They nested in spare uniforms and beneath rolled blankets. They chewed the strings of gas masks. Some swore the rats grew larger every week, fattened on discarded food, or worse. There were stories passed in whispers about what the rats ate when left alone with the dead. A man buried too shallow, a limb exposed by rain, a forgotten body between the lines. Some claimed the rats were unafraid of gunfire, that they crawled over men even during bombardment. One soldier told of waking in the night to find a rat on his chest, staring into his eyes. No one questioned the tale. They had all seen worse. And yet, the rats became part of life. A constant presence, like the rain, like the mud, like the dull ache in the bones after a night spent cold and cramped. Some men named them. Others fed them out of boredom. A few considered them company. Anything that moved, after all, broke the monotony of the trench. One particularly large rat was called General Cobbles. He lived in a hollow near the cookhouse and was said to have survived every gas attack and every flood. When he disappeared for 2 days, rumors began to spread. Had he finally met his end? But then, one morning, he was seen perched on a crate of tinned milk, bold as ever. Someone left him a bit of biscuit in quiet salute. Still, the men hated them. Not because of what they did, but because they reminded them of what the trench was. A place without comfort, without order, where the rules of home no longer applied. The rats were not afraid because they had never known a world that wasn't broken. The rain deepened the silence. Conversations became shorter, spoken in mutters around stove fires or under canvas tarps. Men moved more slowly, not from caution, but from exhaustion. The cold settled deeper into joints. Fingers trembled when tying laces or lighting matches. Some stopped shaving. Others stopped writing. The mail came less often. The food, somehow, became colder. Water was everywhere, and yet never clean. To drink, it had to be boiled. Even then, it tasted of tin and ash. To wash, men used their helmets, scooping rainwater where they could, sometimes sharing, sometimes not. The act of cleaning became ritual, not for hygiene, but for the memory of what it meant to care for oneself. A clean face, even briefly, was a way of saying, I am still a man. And yet, men changed in the rain. Eyes lost their sharpness. Movements grew slower, less precise. The weight of the wet clothing pulled shoulders down. Boots were never light again. They moved through the trench not like soldiers, but like ghosts already buried in the earth. When mail did arrive, it was handed out quickly. The sergeant stood beneath the overhang and read the names aloud. Each letter was a small salvation. Even a blank postcard was treasured. Words from another world. A fragment of dry paper from a place untouched by this ceaseless water. But the rain had ways of reaching even there. More than one letter was lost to it. Ink blurred, paper torn. Entire paragraphs melted into unreadable lines. A few men tried sealing them in tins. Others simply read quickly and folded them into the driest place they could find, usually next to the heart. Dreams changed too. Sleep was rare and fitful, but when it came, it was dampened by cold. Men dreamed of strange places, endless staircases, rivers without banks, faces without mouths. A few dreamed of fire. Many dreamed of being dry. The rats remained. They rustled in the walls at night, knocked over tins, scurried across chests and toes. Some made nests in forgotten corners of the trench. Others were found inside the lining of coats. Once, a soldier unrolled a blanket to find 5 small pink bodies curled in a nest of chewed socks. He did not scream. He simply brushed them aside, shook out the fabric, and wrapped himself up again. Life had no place for surprise anymore. And so the trench endured, waterlogged and gnawed, as the men did their part. They repaired the walls. They reinforced the sandbags. They stood watch in the rain with rifles pointed toward the shapeless dark, eyes squinting against the mist. And when they were relieved at last, when their turn in the line ended and another platoon took their place, they did not cheer. They did not smile. They simply climbed the trench ladder, boots heavy and uniforms sagging, and walked through the mud in silence. Their rest would not be long. They would return. Because there was always more rain, and there were always more rats. Part 5, Shellfire Sky. It began with a sound, not the first sound. That had come earlier, a distant thump far across the horizon, so faint it could have been mistaken for thunder, or the rumble of a train, or a farmer's plow finding stone beneath the soil. But then came the second, closer, sharper. A third followed, and with it, the quiet broke. The men in the trench had been eating. Tin bowls filled with stew, thick with grease and threadbare vegetables. A few sat with their backs against the wall, chewing slowly, savoring the warmth more than the flavor. Others crouched beside the cook stove, exchanging short sentences, eyes tired, hands wrapped around tin cups of black tea. The routine was the same as any other day. And then the sky changed, not in color or shape, but in feeling. The air shifted, thicker, heavier. A stillness fell, not of peace, but of preparation, as if the world itself were drawing breath. The men looked upward without speaking. They knew the signs. The sky above the parapet was blank, but their ears were already attuned. The first real shell came screaming from the east. It fell short, striking the edge of no man's land with a burst of earth and flame. A fountain of mud rose high and curled back down in slow arcs. Dirt rained across the trench line like dark snow. The sound reached them an instant later, sharp, cracking, and final. Another followed, farther down the line. Then two more, closer. Voices rose now, orders shouted, gear grabbed, heads pulled down into collars. Tin helmets were tightened. Rifles lifted from their resting places and tucked against shoulders. The men dropped low against the trench wall, hands over heads, eyes toward the ground. Then the sky opened. What followed was not a storm in the way of weather, but a storm of metal and earth. The shells fell in uneven rhythm, some close, others far. Some exploded with a force that shook the floor beneath them, others with a sharp pop that seemed almost distant. The trench shook. The walls heaved. Loose boards tumbled, and sandbags split open, spilling dark, wet soil onto the duckboards. There was no pattern. Each explosion came with its own rhythm, its own shape. Some burst above the trench, showering the men in jagged fragments of shrapnel. Others buried deep into the earth before erupting from below. The men flattened against the mud. Some curled in the bottom of dugouts. Others covered their heads and waited. Time no longer passed in minutes. It passed in the silence between shells. One moment, the whistle of something falling. The next, the gut-deep thud of impact. Then the second of breathless silence, waiting to know if it was yours. Then another and another. The trench filled with smoke and dust. Breathing became difficult. Coughs rang out, muffled by scarves and hands. Eyes stung. Ears rang. Every sense was filled with noise, yet nothing felt real. The mind drifted between present and past, between the scrape of boots and the memory of sunlight, the scream of steel and the touch of a mother's hand. A dugout collapsed 2 sections down. They felt it before they saw it. The ground heaved, then a muffled roar, then silence. Dust rose in a thick cloud, curling like smoke from the entrance. One man ran toward it, shouting. Another pulled him back. No one spoke. There was nothing to say. The bombardment lasted 40 minutes. Or perhaps it was 10. Or maybe it had gone on forever. No one knew. When the shells stopped, they stopped all at once. The silence returned with a force of its own. Not peace, not safety, only absence. The trench remained, cracked and uneven. Sandbags spilled open, planks splintered, tools scattered. The ground littered with shrapnel and broken things. Men lifted their heads, one by one, slowly, cautiously, as if afraid the silence itself might break. Voices came next, quiet, low, testing the air. Then louder. A call for names, a search for faces, a hand gripping another, a nod, a sigh. A head count was taken. Most were there. 2 were not. One had been in the collapsed dugout. The other had been on sentry. They searched for them. It took hours. The sentry was found first. He had been thrown clear, just beyond the parapet. His helmet lay yards away. His coat was torn. He had no visible wound, but he did not move. They brought him back and covered him with a blanket. His name was noted on a slate near the dugout entrance. The second man took longer. They dug with shovels and hands. The earth resisted, heavy with water and broken boards. At last they reached his coat, then his belt, then his face. He had not suffered long. They said as much, though no one truly knew. He was laid beside the other. The men sat after that. No one was asked to return to watch. The trench was quiet again, but not the same kind of quiet. This silence was not filled with the sounds of wind and water. It was filled with what had just passed. The men sat with their backs to the wall, smoke curling from thin cigarettes, eyes wide but unfocused. The fire in the stove had gone out. No one moved to relight it. They sat in the dim light of a single lantern, its flame flickering like the breath of something not yet gone. The smell was sharp. Cordite, soil, sweat, blood. But beneath it all was the faint scent of something else. Rain on distant stone, the memory of bread baking, of grass just before mowing. It came in flashes. Then it was gone. Someone told a story, softly, about a horse they'd seen once. A white one. At home. No one responded, but no one stopped him. The words filled the space, gave it shape. It was not a story meant to be heard, only told. Another spoke of tea, not the rationed kind, but real tea, in a porcelain cup with milk and honey. He described it carefully, each detail soft, almost sacred, and slowly the trench exhaled. Hands began to move again. A shovel leaned against the wall was set upright. A tin cup was rinsed. The stove was relit. A box of biscuits passed from hand to hand. Even in the aftermath, the rituals returned. Not from need, but from memory. Because to light a fire was to say, we are still here. To pass a cup was to say, we are not yet gone. They would write the names later. They would report the damage. They would send a note, if one could be written. But first, they would breathe. They would listen to the silence, and they would wait for the sky to speak again. Part 6. The Men Beside Me. There were no introductions in the trench. No firm handshakes or nods exchanged under bright lamps. No one announced their arrival with a smile or a story. Names came slowly, like smoke curling from the edge of a cigarette. They arrived in pieces in the way a man folded his blanket or the shape of his silence when the shells fell. A name might come after a week, sometimes longer, but presence came sooner. It was felt in the closeness of a shoulder during a cold night, in the passing of a tin of tea without a word, in the stillness of 2 men crouched in the same corner, waiting for the same sound. The trench did not allow space for distance. You slept near the same men, ate beside them, stood guard with them, dug through the same frozen earth, watched the same sky, heard the same cries in the night. You breathed the same damp air, felt the same rot in your boots, the same mud up your spine, and over time something invisible began to grow. Not friendship exactly, not the kind formed in parlors or on cricket fields, but something deeper, born of silence, of weariness, of the long, slow erosion of fear. You learned a man by how he moved when woken in the dark, by how he handled a rifle, by the way he looked toward the sound of artillery. Some kept their eyes forward, some looked down, some closed them altogether. Each reaction was a language. There was Private Miller from the North Country, a quiet man, tall, broad, with hands too large for his gloves. He barely spoke, but when he did, it was soft and without judgment. He could lift a crate with one arm and light a match with fingers that never shook. He shared his rations without being asked, smiled rarely, but when he did, it stayed with you. There was Hawkins, younger than the rest. He talked in his sleep and kept a photograph in a leather pouch, worn nearly smooth. A girl with a tilted smile. He never said her name. He sang under his breath when cleaning his boots and whistled songs no one else recognized. In quiet moments, he carved initials into the wooden trench supports. No one told him to stop. And then there was Wilkes, who told stories, always in the evenings after the last tea had been poured. His voice was low, his accent clipped, his manner almost formal. He told stories of the sea, of rivers in the south, of horses he'd seen but never ridden. The men listened not for the content, but for the sound. A voice filling the dark was something sacred. None of them were special, but all of them mattered. Because when the ground trembled and the sky cracked open, it was their breath you heard beside your own. Their hands that steadied you when the trench tilted sideways. Their eyes you found in the flash of lightning or the flicker of a flare. And in that shared stillness, words were not needed. Once, during a bombardment, Miller threw his body across Hawkins when a shell struck close. No order was given. No thanks exchanged. It was simply what was done. Afterward, they sat side by side, leaning against the same wall, sharing a single cigarette in silence. They buried Wilkes in the early morning light. A shell had taken him in his sleep, dugout collapsing in a quiet sigh of earth and dust. He was found with one arm outstretched, his book still beside him. They dug a hole behind the trench, marked it with a piece of timber. Someone scratched his name into it with a pocket knife. The men stood around it, heads bowed, not speaking. A chaplain came later and said a few words. But the real service had already passed, in the stillness, and the way the men remained until the last clump of soil had been pressed flat. That night, the trench was quieter than usual. No stories were told. No boots were cleaned. Even Hawkins did not whistle. But the fire still burned, and Miller passed the tea tin to each man in order, as Wilkes had done the night before. The war taught them not to hold on too tightly. Names faded, faces blurred, but actions stayed. A scarf left behind, a book passed from hand to hand, a piece of soap shared without asking. These things lasted. They became part of the rhythm, part of the unspoken code that bound them, not in duty, but in shared endurance. When new men arrived, they were watched closely, not judged, just measured, by how they carried their pack, by whether they asked too many questions, by the way they handled silence. Some adjusted quickly, others never did. One young recruit cried quietly the first night. No one said a word. But in the morning, his tea was handed to him warm. His boots were brushed clean, and a blanket had been draped over his shoulders sometime during the night. No one claimed to have done it. No one needed to. Over time, he found his place, not by speaking, but by listening, by digging, by showing up when called. That was enough. There was no glory here. No medals pinned inside the trench. Courage was not loud. It came in the form of rising after a sleepless night, of standing watch in the rain, of handing a crust of bread to someone hungrier than yourself. And the men noticed these things. They remembered. In the darkest hours when sleep wouldn't come and the wind howled through the wooden beams, a hand on the shoulder could mean everything. No words, just weight, just warmth. A reminder that you were not alone, that someone was still breathing beside you. These were not friends in the old sense. They might never see each other again outside the wire. But in that place, in that moment, they were closer than brothers. Because they knew what it was to listen to the silence together. To sit beneath a sky that did not answer. To rise each day and find their names still unspoken by the sergeant at roll call. And to know, deeply and without question, that the man beside them would not leave. Not until he had to. Part 7. No Man's Land. There was no moon that night. Only a pale haze above the trench, where the clouds thinned just enough to let through a soft silver dimness. Not light, but something like the memory of it. The stars were veiled. The wind had gone still. The trench held its breath. Orders came quietly. 2 men, out and back. A listening patrol. To crawl past the wire and lie in the dark, ears open, eyes alert, mouths closed. No firing unless necessary. No movement unless required. In and out before the flare hour. They nodded. That was all. Gear was checked in silence. Bayonets were removed, not out of mercy, but necessity. A blade could catch the glint of a flare. Rifles slung, knives sheathed, helmets tightened. Coats drawn close. No extra weight. No loose metal. One carried a wire cutter, the other a length of cord. They waited near the parapet. The trench behind them was a murmur of dim lanterns and low voices. Steam from tea fires drifted into the cold air, vanishing before it reached the stars. Boots shifted on the duckboards. A sergeant whispered something and passed a hand over his brow. Another lit a cigarette and cupped the glow in his palm. Then the signal came, a soft tap against the trench wall, and they climbed the fire step. The top of the trench was not high, barely enough to crouch, to slip over without exposing too much. A few sandbags were moved. A plank laid gently across the lip. And then they were outside. No Man's Land welcomed them with silence. The ground was not ground. It was a tapestry of craters, wire, shattered wood, and bones. The mud here was different from the trench, looser, filled with shrapnel and blood. In some places, it was still. In others, it gurgled under pressure, releasing quiet sighs of trapped air. The men crawled slowly, flat against the earth, elbows first, then knees. They did not speak. They did not look at one another. Their world had shrunk to a few feet of darkness ahead, the weight of their gear, the sound of their own breath. Every noise mattered. The creak of a boot, the scrape of a belt buckle, the rustle of fabric brushing against dry grass. They moved in rhythm with the stillness, pausing whenever the wind stirred, though it was faint tonight, just a whisper among distant trees. Barbed wire appeared in front of them. It wound across the ground in thick, rusted loops, tangled and twisted, like the remains of something once alive. They stopped. The cutter moved forward, careful with each step. The wire groaned slightly as it gave way, but the sound was soft, nearly lost in the night. A path was cleared. They slid through. Far ahead, the enemy trench was invisible, but they knew it was there, 100 yards, perhaps less. Somewhere across this frozen field, men watched from shadows. Their rifles rested on sandbags. Their breath fogged the air just as it did here. They waited behind their own wall of mud and death, looking out into the same gray veil, wondering who might be crawling toward them. The patrol kept moving. 10 yards, 15, then they stopped. They lay side by side in a shallow crater, the lip of earth barely shielding them from view. One adjusted the cord he'd brought. stringing it loosely across the edge to mark their position. The other lay still, ear close to the ground, listening. What they listened for was not clear. Sometimes it was digging, a distant scraping beneath the earth, the sound of sappers moving tunnels. Sometimes it was footsteps, a voice, a whisper. Even the shifting of a bayonet against stone could speak volumes. Tonight there was only quiet, not silence. The trench did not know true silence, but a hush so complete it made every heartbeat feel loud, every blink of the eye a disturbance. They waited. Time passed slowly. A flare went up behind them, from their own side. It hissed upward with a sharp breath and bloomed into a white flower overhead. The world turned to frost. In the brief light, the whole landscape was revealed. Craters like broken teeth, wooden crosses leaning at odd angles, rifles buried barrel down in the mud, a corpse lying face down in the wire, coat stiff, helmet missing. Then darkness returned. Just as quickly, the world folded back into shadow. The men did not move. They breathed in rhythm with the dark. The wires sang faintly in the wind. A few minutes later, another flare, this one farther off, from the enemy. The same pale light, the same frozen moment, then dark again. Movement stirred in the far trench, or perhaps it did not. It was hard to say. Shape shifted in the night, took on the form of something alive, then became again only mud and shadow. A rat skittered past, its feet whispering over the grit. The men remained. Each second stretched. The body ached to move, to shift weight, to relieve pressure on elbows and knees, but they held still. Any motion could speak louder than any voice. After what felt like an hour, the cutter touched the cord. 3 short tugs, the signal to withdraw. They began the crawl back, slower than before. The fog had thickened. The ground felt softer. Their legs trembled now, but they did not hurry. Each movement placed with care, each footfall chosen. They passed through the wire, slipped behind the plank, and dropped once more into the narrow safety of the trench. No one greeted them. No applause. No celebration. Just a nod from the man on watch. A pot of tea warming by the stove. They removed their gear in silence, sat down on the damp bench, rubbed their arms, unwrapped their scarves. Steam rose from their coats, and the trench embraced them again, not as heroes, but as part of itself. Later, when asked, they would not speak of what they saw. There was nothing to say, no news to give, just fog and mud and the deep weight of eyes watching in the dark. But the others would not. They would understand, because all who entered no man's land left part of themselves behind. A breath, a footprint, a heartbeat wrapped in wire. And though the men returned, whole in body, something stayed out there, in the cold, in the crater, beneath the silent sky, waiting, as all things in that place waited. Part 8, Gas and Gasping. It began before anyone noticed. Not with noise, not with a flare, not with the rumble of distant guns. It came with the air itself. There was a stillness just before dawn. The sky remained dark, though its blackness had begun to loosen. A thin line of silver had appeared above the eastern edge, not yet light, but hinting at it. The trench was in its quietest hour. Most men slept in patches, some sitting upright, others with their heads on folded arms. A few remained on watch, eyes half closed, minds drifting. And then the wind changed, only slightly, a breath of air that carried no cold with it. Just weight, heaviness, the kind that sits on the skin rather than cools it. One of the sentries sniffed the air. He paused. There was something there. Not a scent, not yet. Just the faintest shift, like water stirring in a still pond. Then, a moment later, it arrived. The edge of it, a sweetness that had no place in the trench, almost like flowers, almost like almonds. The man reached for his whistle. He blew once, then again, longer. The sound pierced the quiet. Men stirred at once. Boots hit the boards. Hands grabbed rifles. Others fumbled for gear. There was no shouting, no panic, only motion, rehearsed, automatic. Gas. The word moved through the trench without being spoken. Masks were pulled from satchels, straps tightened, filters checked. The canvas felt stiff with cold. The rubber edges were worn from use. Eyes disappeared behind thick glass. Breath became shallow and echoed within the hollow of the mask. The sound of it filled the ears. Ha! 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 The hiss and draw of air through a filter, like breathing through cloth in a dream. The gas drifted low. It rolled in waves, brushing the tops of the trench wall, curling over the edges and spilling inside. It moved like fog, slow and deliberate, hugging the ground, seeping into hollows and corners. In the dim light, it took on a color, greenish, tinged with yellow, though this was more felt than seen. No one moved. They crouched low, covered every inch of skin they could, breathed through cloth and fear. A few had not found their masks in time. One man wrapped a sock over his mouth. Another tore a piece of shirt and held it in place with shaking hands. They blinked rapidly, eyes stinging, breath catching. The gas did not roar. It whispered. It did not strike. It surrounded. Within the masks, the world narrowed. Sight became fogged. Sound became distant. Breath was the only certainty. Huh. Huh. They waited. It is said that time behaves strangely when one waits for pain. It does not stretch or contract. It simply hovers. Each second sits beside the last, heavy and unchanging, like drops of water on a field of stone. A cough broke the stillness. Then another, muffled, low. Someone moved. A shadow reached out for a hand. The hand trembled. The fingers curled. They held on. A low wind shifted. The gas began to rise. It lifted slowly, drawn upward by the breeze, dissipating like smoke. The color thinned. The weight in the air lessened. The trench sighed, not aloud, but as a body, as one breath shared by many. One by one, the masks came off, slowly, with caution. Eyes blinked. Faces appeared again. Sweat had pooled beneath the rubber. Beards were damp, mouths dry. A few men spat. Others rubbed their faces with filthy sleeves. No one spoke right away. A kettle had overturned in the panic. Someone righted it. Another man lit the stove. It hissed, as if nothing had happened. Two men coughed behind the dugout. One of them sat down hard. His mask had not been sealed properly. His breath came in short, dry gasps. His eyes were red. A corporal sat beside him and handed him water. The man did not speak. A sergeant made a note on a clipboard. 3 men had been affected. No deaths. Not this time. The trench slowly returned to its rhythm. Letters were resumed. Boots were repaired. A pipe was relit. Someone offered tea, but the gas left something behind. Not a scent, not a mark, but a feeling that the air itself could not be trusted, that even breath, the most natural motion of the body, had become a danger. And so the men watched the wind. They listened for the whistle. They checked their masks more often. They slept with the satchel beside their heads. They tied bits of string around the buckles to make them faster to open. Each action quiet, each motion deliberate, not from fear, but from understanding. Because gas was not like bullets. It did not whistle through the air. It did not strike with force. It crept, it watched, and when it came slowly, like a dream that takes too long to end. That night, the men slept more lightly. Some sat upright, backs against the wall. One man kept his mask on for hours, just in case. The others said nothing. He removed it only after the dawn broke fully, and the birds, rare as they were, had begun to sing again. And the trench, once more, took a breath. Part 9. The Lice in the Latrine. There was no such thing as privacy in the trench. Not in sleep, not in rest, not in the smallest of rituals. The men lived shoulder to shoulder, breath to breath, pressed against one another in narrow dugouts, in fire bays, on wooden slats soaked through with rain. Every motion, every word, every weakness was seen. And still, there were things not often spoken of. One of them was lice. They arrived early in a soldier's time at the front, hidden first in seams, in the folds of a collar, in the wool lining of a greatcoat. At first, they were only a nuisance, small bites, red marks, an itch just above the belt or behind the knee. But they multiplied quickly. They fed on warmth, on blood, on the silence of bodies too tired to fight them. Soon, the itching became constant. Men scratched without realizing. In sleep, in conversation, during meals. Fingernails found their way to skin with a mind of their own. Some rubbed raw patches behind their ears. Others used spoons to scrape beneath their shirts. It was said that the lice could be heard if one listened, the whisper of them moving across skin, the click of their tiny jaws in the dark. There were powders issued. They came in tins with faded labels, a chalky dust that stung the eyes and dried the skin. Men shook it into their shirts, into their socks, into their bedding. Some swore by it. Others said it only made the lice angry. Then there was the burning. Clothes, when possible, were taken off and held near flames, not for warmth, but for the heat. The goal was to cook the lice out of the seams. Shirts dangled above open stoves. Trousers were stretched across tin lids. The air smelled of wool and sweat and scorched cotton. And still the lice returned. No amount of boiling, scrubbing, or powder could keep them away. They were too many, too patient. And in the end, the men accepted them. Not with comfort, but with understanding. One soldier kept a tally of how many he crushed each night. He made a mark on the inside of his helmet with charcoal. Another named his favorite louse as a joke. Most said nothing. They simply endured because that was all there was to do. The latrines were worse. At the beginning, they had been dug with care. Deep holes lined with boards set at a distance from the trench. But time and mud had eroded them. The rain filled them. The earth refused to hold the shape. And so they changed, became shallower, cruder, closer. In some places, they were no more than buckets. In others, just a pit behind a lean-to of splintered wood. The smell was always there, not strong at first. Just a sourness on the edge of the air. But it lingered. It clung to clothing. It soaked into the duckboards. It made its way into food, into water, into the skin. Men timed their visits carefully. At night, with a scarf over the mouth. In the early morning, when the fog was thick. It was not the task that brought shame. It was the conditions. To squat over a pit while shells thundered far off. To wipe with a torn page from a newspaper. To watch rats scurry past your feet as you hurried to dress again. One man fell in once. He had been half asleep. Stepped wrong. They pulled him out. He vomited beside the trench and said nothing for the rest of the day. Later, his coat was burned. He received a replacement 2 weeks later, thinner and more worn. No one spoke of it again. The worst was during the freezes, when the latrines froze solid and men had to chip at the surface with a spade before using them. Or during bombardments, when no one dared leave the trench and buckets were passed from hand to hand. These things were not written in letters. They were not remembered in books, but they were as much a part of war as the rifle and the uniform. And yet the men endured. They joked quietly when they could. They competed over who had it worse. They shared soap when it was available. A bar of soap could buy a favor, could bring a moment of relief. The smell of it, faint, floral, could remind a man of home more than a letter. Some rubbed it on their wrists, just to carry the scent. One man kept a sliver wrapped in cloth, never used, only smelled. A treasure worth more than cigarettes. Cleanliness became a dream, something imagined late at night. A bath drawn in a quiet room, a towel warmed by the stove, clean socks, dry sheets, a mirror that did not reflect grime. Some men wrote of these things, described the shape of the bathtub, the sound of the drain. Others could not remember anymore, and so they scratched, and boiled, and burned, and breathed through scars, and waited for the day the lice would be gone, the air would be clean, and the trench would be behind them. That day did not come, but they held the thought of it like a pebble in the hand, turning it over, feeling its weight, and moving forward. Because to survive the trench was not only to survive the shells and the bullets, it was to survive the small humiliations. To sit in filth and still speak gently, to itch and still laugh, to stink and still shake a comrade's hand without shame. And that was its own kind of heroism. Quiet, enduring, human. Part 10. Letters from Somewhere Else. They always knew when the mail was coming. Not from a sound or a signal or any official word. It was something in the air, a subtle shift, a hush followed by a rising expectation. Heads turned, eyes looked upward. Even the cold seemed a little easier to bear. The mail came in sacks, worn canvas bags tied with string, stamped with dates and codes, carried on carts and shoulders, passed through hands and outposts and weather. They arrived late, often wet, sometimes torn. But they arrived, and when they did, the trench paused. Even the shovel stopped. The sergeant read out names, standing near the fire barrel or beneath the corrugated lean-to, voice steady, one letter at a time. Each name spoken was a breath in the cold. Each man stepped forward quietly, took his letter or his parcel, and stepped back into the fog. Some men received 3 or 4, others none. There was no pattern, no fairness to it, but no one questioned why. It was understood that some had someone who still wrote, and others did not. Some had family, others did not remember if they had ever really belonged to anyone. For those who received nothing, the silence was its own kind of message. But most held out hope, because even the loneliest man might one day hear his name. A cousin, perhaps, or a mother. A girl he had kissed once before the war. It happened more than once. A letter from a stranger. A note that began, "You do not know me, but I wanted you to know you are not forgotten." They folded those letters slowly, as if they might fall apart, as if the ink might vanish. They read them again and again. Even the misspelled ones, even the ones that made no sense, because the words meant something more than themselves. They meant the world beyond was still turning, still breathing, still remembering. Most of the letters were brief. Talk of the harvest, the weather, a neighbor's new baby, sometimes a newspaper clipping, sometimes a pressed flower, once a hand-drawn sketch of a kitten in a basket, another time a poem copied from a book. They came in different handwriting, looping, crisp, barely legible, and in different tones. Some cheerful, some proud, some careful, holding back the truth between their lines. And some were grieving in their own quiet way, not from loss, but from distance, from the ache of not knowing. One letter read, "I hope you are warm. I hope you are fed. I hope you are still the boy who whistled in the mornings." Another simply said, "Come home." The men kept them in tins, in shirt pockets, in helmet linings, They folded them neatly and read them when the rain fell, or when the wind grew too sharp, or when sleep would not come. They read them aloud sometimes in low voices, usually to themselves. A name, a phrase, a question that could not be answered. Some wrote replies. They took pencils and scraps of paper and sat beneath lanterns, hunched in corners, crafting each word like a prayer. Their hands were stiff. The words came slowly, not because there was too little to say, but too much. They wrote of nothing, of everything, of tea that morning, of the way the frost curled on the wire, of the man next to them who had snored through the bombardment, of the way the trench looked when the sun broke through for 10 whole minutes and made the boards steam like a bathhouse. Some told the truth, others spared it. They did not write of lice, or of digging shallow graves in the frozen mud. They did not describe the look in a man's eyes when he knew the shell had landed too close. They described birds instead, or the taste of the plum jam sent last month, or the memory of a kitchen table, warm bread, and the scent of soap on a drying towel. The letters were censored, of course. Every word passed through careful hands before they left. And so the truth came out in pauses, in things not said, in words chosen too precisely. The people at home read between the lines. They knew. They felt it in the shape of the sentence, in the shift in tone between one week and the next, in the sudden absence of a name that used to be mentioned. But they wrote back anyway, because it mattered, because even if the letter arrived too late, it had still been written. And that counted for something. There were days when no mail came. Sometimes for a week, sometimes longer. Those were harder days. Men stared a little longer at the road beyond the trench, listened more closely when the sound of wheels reached the edge of hearing, held their breath when the officer rounded the corner with nothing in his hand. They said nothing, but their shoulders spoke, the way they slumped, the way a man turned away quickly so no one saw his face. But the letters always returned, in ones and twos, in stacks wrapped in twine, in parcels marked with stamps from towns whose names now felt strange. Sometimes there was chocolate, or cigarettes, or socks. One man received a jar of jam. It had cracked in the middle. The glass had cut through the package, but the jam was still good. He shared it with everyone, and for 5 minutes, the trench smelled of sugar, a smell so sweet it made the eyes water. The men spoke of it for days, even after the jar was gone, because it reminded them that the world still held sweetness, that somewhere far beyond the shell fire, there were kitchens, and mothers, and windows that opened without fear. There were letters that never arrived, lost on the road, burned by accident, or buried in mud. Some men never knew what was sent to them, and some never saw the letters they wrote again. But still they wrote, still they hoped, still they waited, because the letters were not just paper. They were proof that someone remembered their name, that someone waited for them, that they had once belonged to a place with clean sheets and morning light. And in the darkest nights, when the trench seemed like the only world that had ever been, the letters reminded them otherwise. And that was enough to carry on. Part 11. The chaplain's voice. He did not arrive with the officers. He did not bark orders or carry a weapon. His coat was simple, dark, and mud-streaked like the rest. His pack was smaller, and he walked with a quiet step, as if trying not to disturb the ground. The others stepped aside when he passed, not from rank, but respect. The chaplain, his presence in the trench was not announced, but it was felt. There was something in his eyes that set him apart. A stillness, not the dull stare of shell shock or the hollow silence of grief, but something more rooted. A calmness like deep water, unshaken, constant. He made his rounds softly. He stopped by the wounded first, not with questions, not with pity, but simply with presence. He sat beside them, held a hand if it was offered, Sometimes he said a prayer, quiet and short. Sometimes he said nothing at all, only stayed until the breath steadied or the pain eased enough for sleep. He moved on to the dugouts next. The men sat straighter when he entered, though he never asked them to. Some offered tea. Others nodded from across the room. A few turned away, embarrassed. But the chaplain made no judgments. He asked only how they were, if they had written home, if they were sleeping. He carried a small Bible, worn thin, but he also carried poems, folded pages, inks, smudged and creased, tucked into a notebook held together with string. He read them in the evenings, sitting on an overturned crate beside the fire, his voice low and steady. Not sermons, not speeches, just words. Words that floated above the trench, above the mud, above the coughing and the scraping, and the long, low moan of wind across the wire. He read Keats and Blake. He read from memory when the paper was too damp to unfold. He read stories that had nothing to do with war, about rivers and orchards and long walks home. The men listened, some with eyes closed, some cleaning rifles, some pretending not to listen at all. But they listened, because the chaplain's voice had a way of quieting things, of slowing time, of bringing stillness where none could be found. He wrote letters for the dying, not long ones, not filled with grand final words, but simple messages. I love you. I'm sorry. Tell Father I'm not afraid. He kept them short so they would arrive before the family had waited too long. He carried the names in a small book, crossed them off when he finished. A list no one else saw. He buried the dead, not with ceremony. There was no room for that, but with dignity. He read a psalm or a poem, laid a hand on the cloth, closed the eyes when others could not. He never hurried. He knelt by each grave as if it were the first. And when he rose, he took a breath before walking away. He sat with the ones who cried. He never asked them to stop. He sat in silence and waited. Passed a rag when the nose ran. Poured tea when the shoulders settled. He never called it weakness. He called it weight, and said it was a burden that did not belong to one man alone. On Sundays he spoke. Not all came to hear him, but many did. They gathered near the edge of the trench, by a small clearing where the wire had not yet reached. The ground was still torn, still soaked, still filled with the memory of thunder. But for an hour, it became something else. A circle of breath in the cold, a handful of candles lit against the gray, a book held in worn hands, and a voice. That was all. He read from psalms, from letters, from poets who had died long before this war, but who had seen other battles. He did not speak of victory. He did not promise protection. He spoke of endurance, of mercy, of holding one another when the night would not end. When a man was too far gone, the chaplain did not kneel. He sat beside the cot, or the stretcher, or the pile of coats arranged to make the shape of a bed. He placed his hands on his knees, closed his eyes, and waited. Sometimes the man would speak, sometimes not. Sometimes there was only the sound of breath coming shorter, and then not at all. The chaplain stayed, even after the last breath, even after the stretcher had been carried away, even after the fire had gone out. He sat, and then he rose, and moved on. The men rarely thanked him, not because they were ungrateful, but because they did not know how. He did not need thanks. He only needed to be present. That was his task, to walk beside the men, not ahead, not behind, but with them, through the cold, through the fog, through the silence that came when the shells paused and the world held its breath. He listened more than he spoke. And in a place filled with noise and pain, that was a kind of salvation, even for those who did not believe, even for those who had not seen a church in years, even for those whose faith had long since slipped beneath the mud. Because the chaplain did not bring answers. He brought peace, and sometimes that was enough. Part 12. The Fallen. They did not ring bells when someone died. There were no trumpets, no songs, no flags, no folded papers placed into waiting hands. Death in the trenches came without ceremony. It came with the same silence that marked so much of trench life. A silence shaped by habit, by endurance, by the need to carry on. The fallen were not forgotten, but they were folded gently into the rhythm of the day. There was no time for grief the way it once lived, with sobs, with hands held to the sky, with rooms filled with flowers and the smell of dust and candles. Here, grief was quieter, smaller, measured in the way a man stared at an empty bunk, or in the silence at the end of a joke that no one finished. It happened often enough that the men knew the steps. When a shell struck, when a bullet found its mark, when someone slipped into silence in the night, the body was covered. A blanket, a coat, sometimes only a ground sheet, anything clean enough to offer dignity. A name was written on a slip of paper, tucked inside the breast pocket. Sometimes it was all they had. The others stood back. They did not crowd. They gave the space the shape of a room. A sergeant made a note in his book. Name, number, unit, place, time. If it had been quick, they said it softly. He didn't suffer. If it had not, they said nothing. The grave was dug by hand. No machines. No priests with spades. Just men with shovels, boots pressed into wet earth, the mud clinging to every motion. Sometimes the ground was soft, sometimes frozen. When it was frozen, they broke through with iron bars, chipped the ice one layer at a time. They worked in pairs, in silence, wiping their sleeves across their foreheads as they went. A wooden cross was fashioned from spare planks, nailed together in a narrow X or a clean T. A name scratched with a nail. A date, if remembered. A number, if known. They laid the body gently, not always in a coffin. Most times in cloth or canvas, but always with care. The chaplain stood by when he could, his hands folded, his head bowed. He read a few lines from the book he carried, or something from memory, or, when neither fit, a poem. Sometimes a few men joined him, sometimes only one. Sometimes the grave was dug at night, by lantern light, the shadows flickering over the men's faces as they worked, the wind moving around them as softly as breath. When the last spade of earth was packed down, the men stood in silence. No one was told to do so. No one gave the command. They simply did it, because to walk away too soon would have felt wrong. There were no tears, not often. Crying in the trench was not forbidden, but it was private, a thing that came later, in the dugout, or under a blanket, or with a letter pressed to the face in the dark. Instead, they remembered in smaller ways. They cleaned the fallen man's rifle and set it aside. They packed up his few things, his mess tin, his comb, his photographs. Sometimes they wrote home, if no family could be found. Sometimes the chaplain wrote. Once, a man found a sketchbook in the pocket of a fallen friend. He tore out the last page and kept it. A drawing of the trench from the night before. Simple. Charcoal lines. A single lantern glowing beneath a sloped wall. He never told anyone. He folded it small and kept it inside his paybook. Not out of sentiment, but because it felt like something that should remain. The bunk was not filled right away. It stayed empty for a night or two. Then the gear was gathered. The boards were cleaned, and a new man was sent to lie down. He would glance at the spot before setting his kit down. He would look once at the others. Then he would rest his head on a folded coat and close his eyes. Because the war did not stop. Because there were still watches to keep, and rations to boil, and boots to clean. And though the men remembered, they could not stop moving. That was part of grief too. to carry on, to place one foot in front of the other, to hear laughter again, slowly, without guilt. The dead remained, in memory, in gestures, in names etched quietly onto helmet linings or scratched into the wooden walls of the trench. Some were remembered for their jokes, others for their singing, some for their silence, a few for a single moment of kindness, a shared biscuit, a warm word on a cold morning. They lived in the stories told in the lull between bombardments, in the way someone poured tea just the way the fallen man used to, in the way someone else kept humming the same tune, not to replace him, but to remember him, because the trench was made of more than earth and boards. It was made of memory, of ghosts that did not haunt, but lingered, softly, at the edge of vision, in the curl of smoke from a pipe, in the shape of a shadow on the wall. The war took many, but it never took them all at once. Each death was felt, each loss folded gently into the day. The trench, in its own way, mourned, and in the morning it continued. Because it had to. Because the men beside you were still breathing, still scratching at their sleeves, still watching the wire, still waiting for the next hour to pass. And so you went on, and carried the name with you. Not loudly, not always with words, but in the quiet, in the way your boots stepped a little softer near the wooden cross, in the way you looked to the east when the sun broke through the fog, and remembered that someone had once stood there beside you, and had breathed the same air, and had laughed at the same joke, and had vanished like smoke into the gray.p. Part 13. A week of waiting. There were times when the war seemed to vanish. No guns, no shouting, no orders carried on the wind. Just stillness, a thick, quiet stillness that settled over the trench like fog. It was not peace, it was not rest. It was the kind of silence that made your ears ring, that filled every corner with weight, that stretched the hours long and thin until you could almost hear them creaking. A week passed like this once. The men did not know when it began, only that one day the shelling stopped, and the next day there were no new orders, and the day after that, the sky turned a pale white and stayed that way. It was not a truce, not officially, just a pause. Perhaps the enemy was resupplying. Perhaps the artillery had been moved. Perhaps the weather had made even the shells tired. Whatever the reason, the trench held its breath. The men waited. They waited for the sound of boots rushing over wire. They waited for the shriek of steel. They waited for the shout, the whistle, the crack of rifles. But nothing came. Only the wind. Only the soft, shifting fog that crept over the parapets and settled on shoulders like a damp sheet. The fog changed everything. It blurred the world into gray. The men could not see more than a few feet ahead. The sandbags disappeared into mist. The duckboards gleamed wet and colorless. Shapes lost their edges. Sounds became ghosts. Even familiar faces seemed distant through the curtain of white. In this quiet, the mind wandered. And that was the danger. When the trench roared with noise, there was no room for thought, no time for memory, no space for fear to take root. But in the silence, the thoughts returned. Soft at first, then sharper. Men sat with their backs against the wall, staring into the fog, lost in old voices. Some wrote letters they would never send. Others polished boots already clean. One man sat for hours, turning a coin in his hand, watching the way it caught the faint light, as if the glint might reveal something forgotten. The routine remained. Rations arrived, tasteless and cold. Tea was brewed over low flames. Boots were repaired. Journals were scribbled in, then tucked away. But the energy had changed. Even laughter, when it came, was different. Less joyful, more mechanical. A way to fill the air with something other than breath. The rats became bolder. With no shelling to scatter them, they roamed freely. They scampered across sleeping men, nested in packs, gnawed at whatever food was left unguarded. One soldier found a rat curled up in his spare sock. He said nothing, just shook it out and moved on. Time lost its shape. Day bled into night. The sky offered no clues. The fog masked the stars. The sun was nothing more than a pale smear behind a white curtain. Men forgot what day it was. Some forgot which week. A man asked for Tuesday's post on a Friday, and no one corrected him. The waiting wore them down. Not in body, but in the mind. It began with small things. A shorter fuse in conversation, a reluctance to eat, a quiet refusal to move from the same spot. Then came the twitching, the muttering, the sudden bursts of motion. The men began to walk the trench more often, not from duty, but from the need to move, to prove they were still alive, still breathing, still capable of action. They cleaned their rifles again and again. They counted rations they already knew by heart. They stood at the fire barrel long after their tea had gone cold. One soldier began to recite a poem under his breath, the same line, over and over, until the others could mouth it along with him. It was not madness, not yet, just the mind turning in on itself, looking for walls, looking for boundaries to lean against. Sleep did not come easily. Without noise to muffle the thoughts, the night stretched wide and bare. Some men lay with their eyes open, watching the pale mist curl against the roof of the dugout. Others dreamt with sudden violence. They shouted in their sleep, or wept quietly, or woke with fists clenched and breath caught. The chaplain visited more often during these days. He brought no new words. He simply sat. Sometimes he read aloud. Sometimes he hummed an old hymn just beneath his breath. A lullaby not meant to send one to sleep, but to keep the darkness at a gentle distance. And then, just as quietly as it had begun, the week ended. A distant crack broke the silence. A single shell, far away, then another, closer, then the rattle of machine gun fire. The trench stirred. Men looked up. Boots shifted. Helmets were adjusted. Rifles lifted. The fog thinned. The gray began to part. The war had returned, and with it, a strange kind of relief. Not joy, not purpose, but rhythm. A rhythm they understood. Painful, terrible, but known. Predictable. It was the waiting that had worn them thin, that had carved quiet hollows behind their eyes. Now, with noise, they could forget again. They could move, act, react, and for all its horror, action was simpler than stillness. They braced themselves, tightened their straps, checked the line, and stepped once more into the pattern. One foot, then the next, not because they believed, not because they were brave, but because the waiting had ended, and the war at least made sense. Part 14, the night before the push. The orders came just after dusk, passed down by runners, handed in quiet voices from officer to officer. A folded paper, a line or two of clean ink, and a date, tomorrow. Dawn. It was not a surprise. Rumors had circled for days. Ammunition had been moved forward. Maps had been studied longer. The officers had spoken in tighter circles, their voices more clipped, their eyes less idle. Still, when the word reached the men, the trench felt colder. They did not cheer. They did not groan. They simply fell into motion. Each man turned inward. There were things to do, packs to prepare, webbing to tighten, socks to check for holes, boots to scrape clean. 100 small rituals, each one carried out not because it would change anything, but because it gave the hands something to do. The sun had already set. The trench was dark except for a few lanterns set into alcoves and dugout walls. The shadows danced gently across the timber. Mud gleamed where boots had passed. Water whispered in shallow trickles beneath the duckboards. The chaplain moved from dugout to dugout. He did not speak much, only paused beside each man, sometimes placing a hand on a shoulder, sometimes offering a flask of tea. A few asked for a blessing. A few asked for silence. He gave both freely. Some men wrote letters. They leaned over crates or bedrolls, pencils scratching across damp paper. Their words came slowly, not because they had nothing to say, but because they could not decide how much to leave behind. Most kept their letters short, a sentence or two, a name, a promise, a memory. Tell Mary the first thought of her until the end. There is a red door near the station. You'll find my book hidden behind it. Don't mourn. Just remember the garden in spring. The letters were folded, sealed in envelopes when possible. When not, tied with twine. Some gave them to the chaplain. Others slipped them into a tin. A few placed them under their pillow and lay beside them as if guarding something precious. Sleep was rare. Some men tried. They wrapped themselves in greatcoats, curled into corners, pressed their eyes shut. But their minds ran ahead. To the wire, to the climb, to the blast of the whistle and the soft resistance of the mud. Most stayed awake. They spoke in low voices, not about what was to come, but about things far away. One man told a story about fishing with his father on a slow river in Devon. Another remembered the taste of fresh bread with warm butter. They did not speak of fear, but fear hung in the space between their words. It filled the pauses. It pressed close in the stillness. It tightened around the ribs and sat behind the eyes. And yet there was no panic, no outbursts, just a solemn rhythm. Hands cleaning rifles, knives being sharpened against boot heels, water bottles being filled and refilled. The sergeants made their rounds. They checked lists, counted gear, spoke in flat tones. They did not say good luck. They said keep your head low. They said remember the signal. They said if you get separated, follow the line. Their voices were steady, but their faces were pale, and their fingers in the lamplight trembled just slightly. The trench itself changed in those hours. It became something more sacred. The mud was the same, the boards still slick. The air still carried the scent of damp wool and tobacco and old tea, but the men moved through it more slowly, with more intention, as if memorizing it, as if each plank, each nail, each notch carved into the wall was worth holding. Because by morning, it might all be different. The machine guns were cleaned. The belts were checked. The signal flags were laid out in proper order. The stretchers were stacked near the aid post. The stretcher bearers did not sleep at all. They stood at the edge of the trench, looking up at the sky, their hands already wrapped in cloth, their faces already tired. Some men prayed, not aloud, not in church voices, but in breaths and in thoughts, in fingers brushing the edge of a photo, and eyes lifted once to the clouds and then closed. The sky remained quiet. No moon, just a soft, gray velvet darkness that wrapped around everything. A few stars, barely visible. The wind picked up around midnight. It stirred the sandbags. It hissed over the wire. It made the lanterns flicker. It moved like a warning. But the men did not speak of omens. They did not ask questions they already knew the answers to. They stood at the fire barrels, warming their fingers. They passed the last of the tobacco. They traded stories like tokens. One man played a mouth organ. Not a tune. Just a few scattered notes, low and wandering. They drifted through the trench and vanished into the mist. There were no grand speeches. No officers reciting lines of courage or duty. Only silence. Only breath. Only the slow passage of minutes. A few men wrote names on tags and tied them to their wrists. Not because they expected to be lost, but because it was easier than being unnamed. It was a quiet act of care, for themselves, and for those who would find them. As the first edge of dawn approached, the trench held its breath again. The sky turned from black to deep blue. The mist began to rise. The sergeant walked the line once more. Helmet on, whistle ready. Men tightened their straps, checked their rifles, stood slowly, one by one, shoulder to shoulder. The moment stretched long and thin. No one spoke, not because they had nothing to say, but because everything had already been said. And now, only the moment remained. And then the whistle blew. Part 15, The Push. The whistle was not loud. It came sharp and short through the gray morning, cutting cleanly through the hush that had settled over the line. Not a scream, not a shriek, just a single note. A signal passed hand to hand, breath to breath, heart to heart. The men rose. Not in a charge, not in a roar, but like shadows lifting from the earth. One foot onto the fire step, one hand on the trench wall. One last breath drawn deep into lungs already half filled with damp and smoke. They climbed, their boots pressed into timber slats, already slick with frost. Their hands gripped the edge, fingers curled in dirt and cold metal. And then, one by one, they stepped up and out, over the top, into no man's land. The morning was still. No sun. Just a pale, bruised sky smeared with drifting fog. The field ahead stretched like a painting in washed-out color. Muted browns, ash-gray grass, and the deep, wet black of churned soil. Barbed wire ran in twisted arcs, its hooks waiting silently. Craters opened like mouths across the ground, filled with water that barely rippled. No shots came. Not yet. The men moved in lines. Not running, but walking with purpose. Each carried his rifle low, bayonet fixed, packed tight to his back. They spoke no words, only the soft sound of boots and mud, the occasional creak of leather, the clink of canteens. A cough, stifled quickly, their breath fogged before them. The fog swallowed the noise. It made the world feel smaller, closer. Like they were walking not across a field, but into a room. A wide room with no walls and no ceiling, where time moved differently, slower, more personal. Behind them, the trench had already disappeared into the mist. Ahead, nothing yet stirred. Then, somewhere in the distance, a sound, the dull boom of a mortar. A crack, a whistle, then silence again. Each man felt the shiver run through his spine. Still, they moved forward, one foot, then the next. Not all marched in perfect lines. The ground was uneven. Some stumbled, some slowed to help. One man dropped a rifle, bent to retrieve it, and walked on with mud clinging to the stock. A shell landed far to the right. Dirt sprayed into the air, followed by the sharp smell of cordite. Another shell fell closer, this one finding a crater and sending water up in a bloom of dark rain. Now came the machine guns, rattling from the tree line beyond the ridge. The sound arrived in bursts, sharp, cutting, impossible to track. Bullets hissed through the air, some passing overhead, others finding their mark. A man cried out and fell, his helmet tumbling forward. Another stumbled, then rose again, teeth clenched, blood streaking his sleeve. Still they moved. There was no turning back, not because they had been ordered, but because to turn was to leave others exposed. And so they pressed forward, across the broken ground, through fog and fire and the sharp cry of steel on stone. A sergeant raised his hand and waved his men left, steering them toward a gap in the wire. They moved quickly now, crouched low, boots splashing through shallow pools. The mud grabbed at their ankles. The wire snared their sleeves. But they moved, through it, past it, toward the smoke. Somewhere ahead, the line waited. The German trench, invisible behind the rise, hidden in mist and fire. Another shell fell. Another man cried out. But there was no time to stop. Only space to move forward. A runner passed, breath ragged, shouting directions. His voice rose above the noise for a moment, then was swallowed again. The chaplain had gone over with them, not at the front, but not far behind. He walked steady, head lowered, a satchel over one shoulder. He carried no weapon, only bandages and names. He found a wounded man in the mud, crouched beside him, pressed a cloth to his leg. Another soldier fell nearby, gasping. The chaplain knelt again. He did not cry out. He did not curse the sky. He worked with hands that did not tremble. Further ahead, the first men reached the outer trench. They dropped into it not with cheers, but with quiet resolve. There was shouting now, the crack of rifles, the hiss of gas shells. But the men had entered something beyond noise. A rhythm not of music, but of movement. Each act carried weight. Each step was chosen, not because they believed they would survive, but because the man beside them had taken that same step. And to stop would be to leave him alone. The wounded called out. Not all were reached. Some lay still. Others pulled themselves behind embankments, tucked into craters, waited. The fog grew thicker. Time folded inward. The men could no longer tell how far they had come, nor how long they had been walking. One man stopped to tear a strip from his coat and tie it around another's arm. Another pressed his back to a shattered tree and breathed in silence for a moment before moving again. By mid-morning, the field was a quilt of motion and stillness. Some moved, some did not, and through it all, the trench behind waited. Its walls empty now, its fire barrels cold, its silence returned. In the far edge of the line, a corporal found cover in a crater and drew a small photograph from his breast pocket. He looked at it, touched the corner with one finger, then placed it back against his chest and rose again. It was not glory, it was not victory, it was duty, it was love, it was the echo of a promise made in a letter, that he would walk forward when the time came. And he had. By noon, the fog had lifted slightly. Figures moved across the horizon, some crawling, some limping, some standing tall. The field was no longer empty. It was marked now, with footsteps, with cloth, with the soft breath of men still alive. They gathered near the new line. They did not speak of who had been lost. Not yet. They sat, cleaned their rifles, unwrapped rations, drank water that tasted of metal and smoke. One man found a pen. He turned to the back of his notebook and wrote a single line. He did not know what day it was. He did not know what town lay beyond the trench ahead. But he wrote anyway, because the act of writing was something that could not be taken. Later that evening, when the fireflies returned and the air cooled, the chaplain sat beside the wounded. He whispered a name, pressed a hand, and lit a small lantern. Its light flickered, soft, steady, like breath, and all around them, the trench waited, not for orders, not for battle, but for dawn, and for the next step forward.